So approach is obviously critically important. I think the main thing is really about transformation. I think there's a statistic out there that something like 70% or 72% of transformation projects fail, and it really comes down to how they approach and kind of understanding where you're at in your life cycle to understand how do you prioritize near term, midterm, long term strategy so that we can start realizing some of this modernization, but understand the impact and the value of that. So if you're looking at kind of decisions, let's say going back to Bala's points of those 5 kind of themes, how do we make a decision on really where we kind of start? We know what that long-term 5-year roadmap looks like, and so what we start to look at is really what is the kind of disruption and the kind of the risk element. So that's one rating. We look at the value creation. And so how much value is it going to bring to a particular either stakeholders within the organization or externally? And then 3 is really kind of time to value. And so then from that, we can start to put together a plan. So what we've come up with is a method around what we talked about earlier, which is how do we take this kind of digitally born or platform-centric business model and take it to traditional businesses and help them realize their kind of born digital model, and do it in a very predictable, very efficient, in a very kind of risk-emissive way so that we can simplify this process. And so we came up with a 7-step process. Really, the first thing we look at is really kind of platform maturity assessment. We'll talk a little bit about what's the context of that, but it's important for any company to understand where are we at today, truly looking at as an operation from a cultural perspective, from a system perspective, and from kind of how we're positioned in the market. How do we look compared to our peers? And then kind of what are others doing in the market, around these type of, models, so that we can then learn and make better decisions on what our strategy may be. And then kind of the next phase of that is really, what we call the digital agenda or digital mandate or transformation plan, or, whatever you want to call it. So this becomes that kind of those core 5 themes that we talked about, and really drive how we're going to kind of roll out that strategy. And then, as we kind of get into number 3 there, this is really looking at kind of out of the box thinking around new lines of business or services that we can, bring to market. And so customers can come to us in a multitude of stages. So it's not a linear process where you have to start at 1 and then you end at 7. The key to our process is that we can quickly assess where a customer is at on their journey, and then quickly determine what are the downstream actions that need to be taken, so that they can successfully start to realize some of those short-term opportunities. At the same time, have a framework that ensures that that they can mature to that kind of best-in-class platform-based business model they're trying to get to. And so one of the key things that we look at is maturity. And if you kind of look at the, across the top there where it says platform consulting, technology consulting, and execution, depending on where a customer is at in their maturity path, which Bala will talk to in a second, will make sense of where we kind of engage, with them. So obviously platform consulting is much more strategic, business related type of work that we're co-collaborating with our customers and kind of reshaping what that future business model looks like, where, technology consulting is they already know what that strategy is. They've got a very clear definition of what their business needs to be to take advantage of this opportunity and this paradigm shift. And now they're looking at really needing technology partners and to help them build that and execute that. And then, or finally, it's really about just purely executing projects. So Bala, when we look at kind of that bottom grid from, the different levels of maturity that we see with customers, can you talk to us a little bit about, what you're seeing there in the market?
So, Matt, I think we are engaging with customers come to us essentially in 4 different stages of maturity, right? So one is typically what we call as early adopters or early boomers, if you can call them that way, right? People typically who are low in the digital curve, and they come to us even in terms of taking our help in defining the digital agenda. So we start off predominantly from step 1 and step 2 of the approach. Right. There are a bunch of customers who broadly have a blueprint and an agenda in place and need our help in designing the platform and then executing the platform. Right. So the first one that I talked about is typically 1 and 2. 3 and 4 are more mature sort of companies who have leveraged technology at least, right? May not have taken the platform route, but then they have leveraged technology and are probably in the higher echelons of digital transformation, right? Based on their assessment as well. So that's where quadrants 3 and 4 sort of typically fit in, and we come in from either from designing, executing platforms, and delivering services. 2-3 things I think which are critical success factors here. One, I think, is really you need to figure out the context of the digital transformation of your customer, right? So I think we typically co-create this with customers. I think that's the first thing. Secondly, I think we have a very structured approach. While it is structured, it's also very fungible. So as you rightly said, Matt, so it could either be a 7-step, it could be 2 or 3 steps, 4 steps, right, depending on where you are in the quadrant. And what I'm seeing with all the, I know, Matt, we have discussed this earlier as well, is that most of the utility companies that we have seen and we have engaged with in the last couple of years are by and large, I think, in 1 and 2, right? And if you compare that with other industry segments, I think that at least from the traditional industry segments, I think most of the other guys as well are broadly either in 2. I see utilities typically either between 1 and 2 or in 1. Right. So it doesn't matter where you are, which quadrant you are. I think what matters is, are you able to contextualize where you are in this quadrant, and can we sort of create a very structured, fungible platformation approach, right, as part of the journey.
So guys, great information. You mentioned, you spoke a little bit about the platform maturity. Looks like a couple of ways to move forward. Can you take us through these?
Sure. So, platform maturity assessment is really, I'll talk a little bit about the context of that. So this is typically where very early stage customers that are, not sure what their strategy and model is, and they want to kind of just get an education around what a platform-based business model could look like for them. So this is typically a, half-day workshop, depending on what we want to cover. But, we're bringing to light what we're seeing in the market, what competitors are doing, and kind of what we see based on what we know about them and where we believe that they're at in their journey. And then we do a co-collaboration session around really kind of unpacking that maturity element. It's critically important for customers to own that versus a third party, but we're there to help kind of guide that so that we can then help customers make an assessment of, what would be a viable path for them as the next step, and, whether or not these are near-term projects that could be easily executed, or it's that top-down approach where, we're really looking at kind of revamping our strategy, and we want to start from the very ground up, going back to that model that Bala showed, which is really about those value creation elements, and then kind of starting up from there. So the platform maturity assessment is really to help leadership and operations get an understanding of, really for them, what is the potential platform-based business model, and also to understand what's happening in the markets, what some of their peers are doing, and what are some of the innovations that are happening with these ecosystems that are being created. And now, Bala, talk to us a little bit about platform workshops.
So I think why do we need this structure of a workshop? I think let me talk about the why, then the how, and then the what of this entire engagement model. It's very important, I think, Matt, at the beginning of this transformation journey. I think de-risking the journey is extremely important, right? So I think the construct of the workshop for us is to get a shared perspective, the customer. So it's completely a co-creation sort of model. And you and I have actually worked on some of these workshops, right? Wherein I think we've engaged a CXO level sort of an audience, typically in a co-creation sort of a model. The goals and objectives really being, can we define this a roadmap? Can we define the critical success factors for this digital transformation journey, depending on the context of where you are in the journey? I think that's really the why of it. How do we do it? I think I talked about concepts of platform thinking. I think design thinking. So I think a very innovative approach, an outside-in approach of really putting the customer in the middle of everything, right? So if you're taking the utility segment, right? So we could have themes around downstream consumer experience. We could have themes around digitizing the grid. You could have themes around complete energy management or work management. So it's really about synthesizing and identifying, creating breakout sessions, and taking a design thinking approach. So what's the outcome and what is the output? I think 2-3 very key outcomes. One essentially is a roadmap in terms of could be a long-term, mid-term, short-term sort of prioritized sort of platforms, ideating around platforms. What could be those 2-3 platforms that could help you digitize your core or create value-added services? One, what are those small programs or initiatives which you can undertake, if I can call them, say, as quick wins, right? Because I don't think a CFOs typically sort of sign this off if we do not have a business case, right? So I think we enable a creation of ROI and a business case through identifying and prioritizing on some realizing some quick win programs, high impact programs. And of course, I think needless to say, the other artifacts typically include a business architecture, a platform technology architecture, and some of the digital business processes that I was alluding to. We've also, Matt, I think, as we talked about earlier, right, we've built a fairly robust industry-centric digital process library. I think especially for the utility segment that we've been focusing on for the last 2 to 3 years, right? I think we have sort of across the 5 teams that we talked about, we've built a fairly robust library, I think, which we can leverage as part of these collaborative workshops.
Yep. Some customers don't have the time and want to immediately look at adopting some of these things. So to Bala's point, we have the predefined models, that are for utilities so that they can kind of fast track on some of these initiatives, while
That's
other
right.
ones we may look at, redefining from the ground up. So.
Sure. Yeah. So one thing, yeah, I think I missed sort of highlighting this, Matt, is I think you could have workshop in a box, which is really about a couple of hours, or it could be 2 to 3 days, or it could be probably a sort of a week-long sort of an engagement, right? Or I think we have had cases wherein I think we've sort of had consulting engagements which span out of these workshops with 2 to 3 weeks sort of an engagement. But by and large, I think the objective here is to contextualize. Again, I keep mentioning that word, right? It's contextualized to the digital agenda and the journey where the customer is as part of his digital transformation journey.
Guys, that's fantastic. You've given us a lot to think about. I think you've made a very compelling argument for leveraging platforms and changing the business model. And I think you've outlined very well some great ways to get started. So I want to first thank you all for sharing your time today. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Bala. If you're interested in reaching out to Matt, his email is m.fole@sonatasopris.com. You could set up some time to talk to him about your utility or your specific use case. If you'd just like to hear some more conversations like this between some experts, if you see at the bottom of the right of the screen there, you can go to sonatasopris.com/utilities webinars. This event will be listed as well as some other events. And that will conclude digital transformation for the modern energy utility. Thank you.